Thank you so much for being here today. It's a very important topic that we are covering today. If you were in Texas in February, there's a good chance that you were cold. And after taking health for granted, we had a pandemic, and now we know that we cannot even take the power for granted as well. So today we have an amazing speaker to discuss that. Thank you so much, Mary Anne. Thank you so much, Mary Anne. Before diving in, let me say a few words about the French American Chamber of Commerce. I'm Constance Boss, I'm the director of the Chamber of Commerce. We have a great network in Texas. The French businesses are the second foreign employer in Texas, so we have quite an interesting footprint. You can see on the slide the type of companies that are in our network. We offer different types of services to our members. We offer mainly some business development and business connections in our network. We also have some services on innovation, because our great connections in different industries were able to identify some innovative technologies for our members. And the third aspect that is interesting for our individual members is the career support that we offer. I'd like to mention as well that we offer some French business classes. If you want to learn with us, you're welcome. We have great classes. Okay, so this was my advertising of the Chamber of Commerce. Let's dive in the topic of the day. I wanted to highlight that Mary Anne, our speaker today, is on the cover of our magazine. As you can see, I really encourage you to read her interview. I'm very impressed by Mary Anne's career. She's today the CEO of EDF, and she started as an engineer. And I was also impressed with her involvement in the community. She's involved with different nonprofits, and she really makes a difference empowering women. So this is an interesting piece to read. You can find it on our website. So getting back to the topic of the day, I will leave the floor to Brett Perlman, and Brett is today the CEO of the Center for Houston Future. Brett has as well an impressive career, and what is super interesting for us today is that he was a commissioner for the Public Utility Commission of Texas. And what just to conclude, I want to say that we are lucky to have both Mary Anne and Brett today. I know they have a tone that is very free. So I invite you to ask your question in the chat, and Brett will ask his question, and we'll also take the question from the audience. So thank you once again, and Brett, I give you the floor.
Okay, well, thanks, Constance. It's really my pleasure to do this. We've done this a number of times with the French American Chamber, who's been a great partner over the last couple of years that I've been at the center. And I'm very pleased today to be with Mary Anne Brelinksy. Mary Anne has been a friend as well since I was on the Public Utility Commission way back when, really at the turn of the century. It doesn't seem like it's been 20 years. But we worked together on the creation of the ERCOT market, and she has gone on to fame and fortune as the CEO of EDF, which has grown its business in Houston quite substantially. And so I'm very pleased to be with Mary Anne today and hear a little bit about her perspectives on the ERCOT market. And obviously, we're going to talk about the February freeze, which is on everybody's minds, and perhaps give some insights into what happened, and maybe have a discussion about it, and then open up the floor for questions. If you do have questions, if you could put them in the chat, hopefully we'll get to them at the end of the hour, and have some time for to see what's on your mind, as well as some of the questions that she and I will discuss. So Mary Anne, without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and let's hear a little bit about your perspective on the ERCOT market.
Thanks, Brett. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So I have for you about 30 minutes worth of slides that go through and highlight my perspective through the winter storm that we experienced in February. So this is a picture one of my colleagues sent me, a screenshot from a meeting we were having. I'm in my living room. It was 42 degrees in the living room. I've got my ski vest on, ski pants, hat. You know, again, I think what's going to be interesting through this presentation is just kind of the unique things that happened. And unlike some of the other presentations I've seen, I do want to highlight the things that worked well. There was a lot of innovation. There were a lot of smart people working very diligently to keep the lights on in Texas. But before I get going, I did want to give you my standard disclaimer. Any views or opinions presented in here are solely mine and not EDF, EDF Group, EDF Trading, EDF Renewables, EDF Energy Services, or any of our affiliates. So EDF Group, which the French American Chamber of Commerce, clearly you guys are aware of EDF, Electricité de France. This is one of the few venues where I don't have to say it's not the Environmental Defense Fund. So big French utility, largest clean energy producer in the world. And as Brett mentioned, I'm responsible for our North American business units. Specifically, 3 business units in North America. The first is our generation and producer services business. So we buy energy directly from the source or the producer. That might be the power station, it might be a gas producer. We then have a business unit that's trading and marketing. So I've got power traders and gas traders who are buying that energy, moving it geographically, hedging and shaping and optimizing the wholesale products, and then selling energy directly to retail, large commercial and industrial customers. We are the 5th largest retailer in the United States, and we do that without serving a single home. It is all commercial and industrial loads. So I was a bit more like Switzerland throughout this storm than maybe France, in that we didn't own the generation we dispatched. That week of February, we had 52 resources in ERCOT that we were dispatching into the market. Everything from natural gas, wind, solar, batteries, demand response. And we had a lot of large industrial loads who were hedging and optimizing their consumption. So we did have a front row courtside seat to how the storm impacted the different market segments across the ERCOT group. So what caused Texas to power down? And you know, every story needs a villain. And there have been a lot of finger pointing going on across different forums. And I would argue that the villain in this case was the weather. It was similar to a Category 5 hurricane hitting the entire state of Texas at the same time. We, the grid, was not ready for it. We, the public, were not ready for it. And so, you know, versus using all of our energy to figure out whose fault it is, I think first, it was the weather's fault. The polar vortex, which, you know, I almost think we use that term too casual, but the polar vortex is normally, historically, a stable vortex that sits up at the North Pole, and our strong jet stream keeps all that cold air sitting on top of the planet. But when that jet stream breaks down, that cold air is able to move south. And 3 of the last 8 winters, we have seen that strong jet stream break down and allow these frigid cold temperatures to come far south. And what happened in February was such an extreme breakdown that these Arctic temperatures hit South Texas, which is something that, you know, is, you hear people talk about a 1 in 100 year event or storm. I think maybe we're underestimating how long 100 years is, but ultimately, what caused the power outages? The weather. The second piece is around our planning, that we were unprepared. When we look at what's the worst case scenarios, and for a forecasting and planning perspective, ERCOT used the winter of 2011. So we used a winter 10 years ago as our worst case scenario. And as human beings, we tend to be fairly optimistic creatures, and we underestimate the probability of bad things happening to us. And clearly, the winter of 2011 wasn't a severe enough worst case scenario for us all to be managing our planning resources to. And then the last root cause of the the rolling brownouts. And one of the things you'll see me that I'm very careful with, a blackout is a catastrophic failure of the grid, a total shutdown. What we experienced in February were rolling brownouts. So they were controlled. We maybe lost the rolling part of it for a lot of neighborhoods, but they were controlled. The wires companies opened breakers and manually shut down the loads. So the last root cause was really coordination between the natural gas and the power markets. And I've got a couple points that I'll make on that later in the presentation, but it was clear in the aftermath during and immediately following the storm that we did not have a good handle on critical gas loads and making sure that those loads did not get curtailed or shut off when the rolling brownouts began. So I'm going to walk you through my perspective of that week of the storm and kind of what I was looking at and thinking about. Starting on Friday, the 12th, so the Friday before the week of the storm, and the way the power and gas markets, typically are trading on Friday. We're doing work for the weekend and Monday. Well, Monday was also a holiday. So on Friday, we were buying and selling gas and scheduling power for Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. And I think that was one of the issues we had is the weather in Houston was still pretty mild on Friday. We hadn't seen any freezing temperatures. The sun was shining. Everyone was really focused on Tuesday, thinking that Tuesday, the 16th, was really going to be where the storm hit and where we were going to have our issues, and that we still had multiple days to prepare for that. In hindsight, we should have been paying attention to the Texas Panhandle. The weather in the Texas Panhandle did not get above freezing on the 10th, barely got to freezing on the 11th, and was still below freezing the entire day of the 12th. The week prior, we were already losing gas infrastructure to the freeze that Friday. Several of our wind farms up in the Panhandle were already iced over. And I think if we had been paying attention to the broader picture and what was kind of heading in our direction, we would have had a bit of a head start, or at least been more aware of how severe the potential outcomes of the storm could be. So one of the things that my husband will tell you, it's obnoxious, but when we go through events like this, I often screenshot or capture things on my phone so I can look back later and see, what were we thinking? So through this presentation, you're going to see several screenshots from my phone of things that I thought were interesting during the week of the storm. The first one here is on weather.com. This is Saturday evening, 8:30 at night, and I'm looking at my weather app and seeing 1 to 3 inches of snow for Sunday. And that was the first time I had seen that the weather had backed up, not just from a Tuesday storm or even a Monday evening storm, but a Sunday storm, and significant. And anyone who lives in Houston can tell you 1 to 3 inches of snow, our city shuts down. There's no mobility. And I grew up in New York, so 1 to 3 inches up there is no big deal. Here in Texas, this is virtually catastrophic coming at us. The second thing I want to highlight, and some of the screenshots, and these are all publicly available sources. For those of you who aren't in power per se, ERCOT, www.ercot.com. So ERCOT is like our air traffic controller. They don't own the airplanes, they don't own the loads, they just try to make sure everything gets dispatched and arrives safely. Blaming ERCOT for a power plant tripping, it's like blaming the air traffic controller if United's airplane has a maintenance issue. ERCOT really is the conduit to help keep reliable infrastructure, but they don't own the power station, they don't own the wires, they don't own the loads. They're just there to help make sure everything gets done safely. So what I wanted to highlight from ERCOT, and there's a ton of great information on the storm out on their website already, was that today's outlook chart. So this is what an ERCOT's today's outlook chart should look like. This is from last night. I grabbed it around 9 o'clock. It's beautiful. This is a model example of what it should look like. The orange line is our actual capacity. So think of that as dispatchable megawatts available to the grid, what was online and running, capacity that ERCOT had at their disposal to move up or down to keep everything in balance. The green line is our actual consumption or our demand. Those two lines should never touch. It reminds me of my favorite movie growing up was Ghostbusters, and don't cross the streams. These two lines should never get very close to each other, because we do need to balance supply and demand in real time to keep our grid healthy. And that spread, the delta between those two lines, is our safety cushion. It's our safety net if there's a significant power station outage, or if we've under forecasted how hot it's going to be on a given day. It's that spread between those two lines that gives us comfort that everything's going to be okay on the power grid. And last night things looked beautiful. Well, this is Saturday, February 13th. And if you look closely, the lines touch. It's not supposed to happen. So we had our first near miss on Saturday, and most people were not really talking about how close we came on Saturday. Power prices went up over $5,000 a megawatt. So normally the power prices in Texas are $20, $25, $30. So it's significant when you see $5,000 a megawatt. The good news was on that Saturday that ERCOT did have some dispatchable generation. They were able to recover, but that should have been a signal again that even as early as Saturday, we were not able to maintain that healthy cushion between the orange line and the green line. Sunday was Valentine's Day, and it certainly did start getting cold. And at my house, we were starting to charge all of our devices and kind of get ready for what I thought would be the rolling brownouts that would hit. I do think that, and there's been a lot of talk of this both at ERCOT and in the Texas legislature about how to better prepare the public when we have a storm of this magnitude. And I think the tone of our messaging was too soft. I pulled this particular Valentine's Day update off of the internet. It was on CPS's website, basically highlighting that ERCOT has the tools and procedures in place to maintain a reliable electric system during tight grid conditions. This does not scream everybody batten down the hatches, make sure you've got blankets and water, your batteries are charged, and you've shut off any particular load consuming device that you have. One of the things that I would love to see added into these are for pool pumps. I have done a bit of research in hindsight, as it was one of the few arguments my husband and I got into. Is I insisted that he shut the pool pump off and drain the water out of it, which is really easy. There's just one little plug you pull. We have about 1,000 megawatts of pool pump load in ERCOT. And from my just personal scope of the market, I think most of it was running. And it's kind of silly when you think 1,000 megawatts of load, which is as big as a very large power station, running in the middle of a freezing storm to protect the pool pumps. Moving into Monday morning, and this is really for the week, this was my scary time. We're talking early in the morning, 1 a.m. This chart starts at 1:23. If you're power people, you've probably studied this in great detail. If not, all I want to highlight here is things got very tight. Our supply demand balance, ERCOT didn't have enough generation to dispatch. And at that point, to keep the grid stable, their only option is to start shedding firm load. And that means shutting off power to neighborhoods. And so it was 1:23 in the morning that ERCOT entered what we, our DEFCON 1, which is for us EEA 3 alert, and started shedding or turning off residential consumers. One of the problems we have, and if you look at what's happening around the 143 mark, we lost 3 more power stations right after ERCOT gave that notice to the wires companies. And I do think there's a connection there in that a lot of the power stations that need natural gas to run, there are gas compressors that keep that natural gas flowing through the distribution pipelines. And several of those got turned off. So the power stations that were running all of a sudden lost fuel pressure. They lost their gas and tripped offline. So we saw this first place of interconnection between what was happening on the power grids impacting our natural gas distribution system, which then in turn impacted power grids. So it was almost this death spiral of I have to shed more load. Oop, I got more gas compression accidentally, unintentionally shut off, and then I lost more power stations. 1:53 in the morning, and I was awake and on the phone with some of my energy managers in our real-time desk here in Houston. It was very scary. So a power station basically needs a level of frequency to keep running, otherwise it will break. And so it has protection measures inherent to that power station. And Comanche Peak, which is really big nuclear power station here in Texas, has those devices on it. And if the system frequency goes below 59.4 for 8 minutes, that power station will trip offline. We were 5 minutes into the event when luckily we had some ERCOT operators who were aware the clock was ticking and insisted on shedding more load quickly. We were 3 minutes from Comanche Peak tripping offline. If that large nuclear power station had tripped during this event, there wouldn't have been any ability to backstop that loss. And ERCOT has come out and said we would have had a full-fledged blackout. So not the rolling brownouts, but think blackout. Blackout means no electricity, hospitals and nursing homes and grocery stores, ATMs, gas stations, water pumps. And in ERCOT's estimation, it would take 4 to 6 weeks to get the power grid back up and running. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later, because I think as an industry, it's one of the issues that we need to solve really, really quickly. Monday was also a bank holiday, which added a little bit to the chaotic nature. It was the first morning I had an emergency board meeting at 4 a.m. To get additional collateral posted with ERCOT. We normally post for our retail business about $50 million with ERCOT. That's our amount of collateral we have to have posted. At the peak of this event, EDF for our customers had $3.6 billion posted. And because we're owned by a large French utility and we've got liquidity and capacity to meet these, we were able to continue to participate in the markets throughout the week. There were a lot of counterparties who were not able to make those collateral calls and subsequently had issues. We were lucky, but the bank holiday did add to the crisis in that we needed to post more money, but the banks were closed. Well, luckily, EDF in London was open because it's not President's Day there, so we were able to meet the collateral requests. But the bank holiday did add to our troubles. If you look at that today's outlook chart, so this is now Monday the 15th in the evening, and look at how those lines are touching. You can see early in the morning when ERCOT started telling the wires companies to shed the firm load, several more close calls where the green line and the orange line, where there is just no additional capacity to dispatch, and ERCOT had to continue to manage by turning off load customers because there weren't any incremental generation customers to turn on. Moving into Tuesday, the 16th, the generation outages at that point did stabilize, if you can call almost half of our generation an outage stabilized. We had lost South Texas Nuclear Project. One of their units had tripped offline from a safety sensor, a water-free sensor. But at this point, it looked like, okay, that we're at least holding steady, and that the ultimate things are starting to be able to be dealt with. I mentioned that the weather was the villain in this story, and there have been a lot of people pointing fingers at the different generation fuel types. What this chart, and this is off of ERCOT's website, shows that it was an equal opportunity storm. We had natural gas outages, we had wind outages, we had coal outages, we had nuclear outages, we had solar that was covered in snow. So it really did impact. There wasn't a shining star of a resource that just, didn't have to experience it. The coal was one of the more innovative stories, in its old school, but LCRA had mentioned in one of their press conferences that they had employees out shoveling. The coal piles had frozen, and the conveyor belts weren't working. And so they were actually using humans to shovel coal to keep the coal plants running, which again, people were doing everything in their power to keep the lights on. Wednesday, the load shed continued, and the peak load shed here, this actually could be my house. We lost power early in the morning on Monday and didn't get it back until late in the day on Wednesday. But ERCOT did continue to try to manage keeping the grid stable by basically shedding residential consumer consumption. And then on Wednesday was the peak natural gas shut in. So for all of those gas plants, Wednesday was the day where we saw the largest amount of gas unavailable because the infrastructure was frozen. Thursday morning, and there's been a lot of talk about Thursday and what should the price have been. This is today's outlook on the ERCOT website from early Thursday morning. So this is 6 o'clock in the morning on Thursday. And you can see that the first part of the day, yes, there's a nice healthy margin between the green and the orange. But if you look at the forecast for what ERCOT thought was going to happen later that day, that green line goes back up to 64,000, and the red line is significantly below that. And I had mentioned earlier, those lines can't cross. Physics doesn't let that happen. So this forecast was a bad signal for ERCOT, and is really the justification they give for saying why they wanted to keep prices at the cap was to keep the industrials offline and to keep all of those gas-fired power stations online. Market cap pricing persists through the day on Thursday. I mentioned that power prices in our market are typically, around $20. We did see $9,000 price cap prices for several days. On this particular chart, the blue line is our day-ahead market. The orange line is our real-time market. But you can see just the significant material increase in prices that persisted across Thursday and into Friday. And Friday morning was really when the sun came out. We were above freezing again in most of the state. And I was here in my office, and it was 9:30 in the morning, and ERCOT, called the desks, the QSCs, and said, okay, we're coming out of level 3. We're going to back down to level 2. We're basically out of the woods. And I walked out of my desk and out of my office and let out the most triumphant shout and walked over to my real-time desk. And my real-time trader operator was crying. My head of Gen Services had tears in his eyes. My head of regulatory was crying. It was such an emotional week for those of us who were doing everything in our power to keep the lights on, that it was just such a palatable relief to say we got through it, and we did everything we could to keep the lights on. The chart on the right side of this slide does show the gen stack by fuel type, and it is interesting when you look at it was really natural gas power stations that came in and filled that material increase in demand that we needed to meet all of our loads. So I did mention early in the meeting that there were going to be a couple examples of things that did go well, things that worked. The first, and this was public, my first job out of college was with Exxon, so it always will hold a special place in my heart. But Exxon turned themselves into a power plant. And so any of you who have ever been by Baytown and seen these huge refineries and chem plants, they actually shut down the refinery and the chem plant and pushed 200 megawatts onto the power grid, turned themselves into a power station, which was enough to serve approximately 100,000 homes. And when you look at how close we were on that Monday morning, this could have been the difference between a full blackout and the rolling brownouts. Another is there's been a lot of talk of coordination between gas and power, and that we have electrified a lot of our natural gas compression stations. There's a company, Dual Drive, who actually has the technology to switch between the two. And so they can run on electric when it makes sense, but when there's an issue like we experienced in February, they can actually continue to run the gas compression using the natural gas fuel, which is in their pipeline. And so, I feel like some of the gas guys have gotten a bit of a bad rap, but there are technologies and infrastructure out there that can allow us to continue to keep moving that gas, even if there are significant issues on the power grid. Another one of our customers that we work a lot with is TECO. This is the power station behind the medical center here in Houston. TECO put in their power station back in 2010. And in that storm of 2011 that we talked about, they had an issue, they had a trip, and they learned from it, and they winterized, and they bought firm gas. And this peaker plant that would normally run 5 to 6 hours most times, ran 7 days. It was the little engine that could. It did an amazing job. And again, when you think how close we were Monday morning, this could have been the difference between us and having Texas shut down for a month with no electricity. And then lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one of my own team, innovative. One of our gas guys had an idea of, hey, we got a canceled LNG cargo. We can use the feed gas that would otherwise have been put on a boat and sent, to Asia, turn the gas around through the infrastructure, transport and storage, and get it to a power station. And so we were able to use the regas to run a power plant that otherwise wouldn't have had any fuel. And wouldn't have been able to run. So was really impressed. There's not a playbook for that. So again, people being using some ingenuity to come up with creative ways to keep the lights on. So in conclusion, lessons learned and how we move forward from this event. Again, I think if we need a villain, it's the weather. But we do need to make sure that our gas infrastructure and power infrastructure is winterized to be able to handle these types of events in the future. We need to do a better job of planning, both for summer peak, which I think in Texas we're really good at, because that's always kind of been our Achilles heel, is how do we meet that summer peak? But clearly the winter peak for us is just as important. And as we continue to add more renewables onto the grid, making sure we understand the reliability requirements associated with that so that we can all have a robust, reliable power grid in Texas. And then lastly, and this really is one that I am beating the drum on, is blackout restoration. So to the extent there is a blackout, which we've never had in the state of Texas, but to the extent it did happen, it can't be 4 to 6 weeks to get the grid turned back on. It's 4 to 6 days. And I do believe that with the technology advances we have, with the collective minds working, this is something that is not only possible, it's probable, and that we as an industry need to do. So that is my presentation around the winter storm. Let me stop sharing my screen and be happy to take a couple questions if there are.
Well, there's tons of questions and I have some. So I'll start, and then I saw a bunch in the chat. We have, I guess, a little under a half an hour. So I know we could probably be here all day, but we'll just get started. First, I just want to start with this idea. And I think you've done a really excellent job of explaining this in very simple terms, which I appreciate because this is a very complex thing. But do you feel that we have a full handle even today on the causes of the blackout, or do you still feel that there are things that we don't know? And is there more work to be done on understanding exactly what happened?
Yeah, I think at this point, there is a tremendous amount of information. I think there still are some unanswered questions around natural gas compression that was on a critical list that shouldn't have been interrupted, but was. Why did that happen, and where did that communication break down? I think there was probably a lack of communication of how much of those intermittent resources were really frozen in. I'm not sure there was a good communication back to ERCOT of how severe, the icing over on some of the wind farms in West Texas, or the gas producers, really was. So I do think that we're aware of the main root causes. I think one of the places that I think we need to study better again on this forecasting and how bad we clearly missed the storm. When I left here on Friday, we were thinking Tuesday morning peak was going to be when things got hairy, and clearly things got hairy on Sunday. So what did we miss? And I think one of the things we missed, and there's on the EIA website, so government website, you can go and heating demand in Texas is interesting, and it's different than from where I grew up, where it's heating oil, or now more homes are being converted to natural gas. In Texas, especially in South Texas, we have a lot of electric baseboard space heaters because it's so mild here all the time. Don't find a lot of that kind of infrastructure in homes the farther south you go. And because the weather was so cold and went so far south that it was late Sunday night, early Monday morning, freezing temperatures in Corpus Christi, and you had all of that heating demand turn on. I don't think we were prepared for how big a heating demand bubble we were going to see in the middle of the night. That, and everybody had their pool pumps running, which again is one of my now pet peeves, is I think we need to be doing some simple, when we ask people to do certain things, hey, shut off your pool pump, pull this one plug, you'll protect your pool pump and you'll help your fellow Texans out. There are over 500,000 pools in the state of Texas. I mean, it's a lot of energy that was, in my opinion, silly. Nobody was swimming at 2 o'clock in the morning Monday. It was freezing out. It was just running pool pumps to keep the water moving.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about this. So I looked in your last recommendation there. You said weatherize. And I think I just caught that you suggested that the weatherization ought to go through the entire value chain. Is that what you said? I believe.
Well, I think it is, and there's a reason for it. Is if part of the requirements for us being able to meet this winter demand is that gas-fired power stations are running, it doesn't make sense. We could winterize the power station, but if the upstream gas compression freezes, or the wellhead freezes, it doesn't matter. You got a big piece of steel that doesn't have any fuel going to it. So until you go all the way back to the wellhead, you're not really winterized. I think it would create a false sense of security if you didn't go back and look at the entire chain.
Okay. So I know that there's been a lot of controversy about this, and this kind of goes to my question a second ago about what the causes were. There's been a lot of controversy about whether we need to winterize the gas system, but you do feel that that's something that we ought to be thinking about all the way back to the wellhead.
I think if we're going to need as much natural gas generation to meet these types of events, then I don't see how we get away from it. Now, if I were to, again, and I'm Switzerland, so I don't own the gas, I don't own the power stations. I'm in the middle.
Okay.
But what I can see is for the gas infrastructure, you say, okay, I can winterize, but it's going to cost me something, and my gas is going to cost more. So if I'm a power station that's going to need to hit and make megawatts during these events, and I've sold my energy firm, I should make sure I'm buying firm gas, which costs more, which then allows the pipes and the gas producers to get some revenue to winterize. And at that point, everybody's sharing in the burden of what does it really cost to have power at 2 o'clock in the morning on February 14th.
So I was going to ask you that question because you gave the TECO example where they bought firm power, right? Most of the plants, firm gas, sorry. Most of the plants in ERCOT don't have firm gas, right? They're mostly interruptible.
Because it's more expensive.
Yes. And so what do you think ought to be done there?
Some do. Well, again, it's a risk mitigant that says, if in a deregulated market where you're not required and you can sell a firm power and not buy a firm gas, and you're taking that risk. I think a lot of people learned in February that's pretty expensive proposition to put on. If I've sold fixed power, if I can't run, I'm having to buy back at 9,000. I promise that the firm gas doesn't cost that much.
So it's kind of like the thing about next time I won't. Next time we have, what was the thing about next time there's a boom, I won't piss it away. Next time there's a blackout, I won't make that mistake. Maybe we'll learn the lesson, but maybe we won't. We didn't learn it in 2010. So I don't know. Do you think there is a role for regulation in requiring, some sort of firm supply, or what ought to be the policy there, do you think?
Well, and that's a pretty complicated regulatory. I would ask you what you think, Brett. You were in those chairs. I mean, it's a tough conversation to have. I think that in Texas, if we had had a capacity market, the same thing would have happened. It wouldn't have stopped the outages Monday morning. I think if we were integrated and synchronized with the rest of the US, it wouldn't have helped. Entergy and SPP were having similar issues and doing rolling brownouts themselves. They wouldn't have had any power that they could, certainly not enough as much as we needed if we wanted to keep everybody online. So there's that. I think also the wires companies and where this storm really broke down, I think, is people were not prepared, and they were thinking, okay, if I have an outage, it's going to last 30 minutes to an hour. And my house, we were out 65 hours. And it was 40 degrees in the house. And thank goodness we have a natural gas fireplace, because that was the only thing that kept the pipes from freezing. Although I kind of hope I would have been smart enough to shut the water off and drain the pipes before that happened, but I don't know. So I do think, though, that the wires companies have hatchets. They have very big axes of what load they can curtail versus having a more nimble and we've got, big chunks of load versus being able to have a more granular view. And we've got critical loads, which are dependent on having electricity 24 hours a day. So if you say, okay, well, if everybody's expected to be able to have 8 hours of some other backup, that's a different answer than if you tell people, no, if you're on this critical load, you're never going to get curtailed. And so I do think from a consumption side, there's some education that has to be done, but there's also on these critical infrastructure and how outages are handled. We need to be much more sophisticated in them. And this is in no way pointing fingers, because things had gotten so bad so quickly. The only thing we could do was trip huge chunks of load. I've heard a lot of the criticisms were, well, why my neighborhood for so long? And my husband was asking me, are we being punished because you work for an energy company? I was like, honey, they don't even know that I'm in this neighborhood. No, we're not being, we're in a big neighborhood with no critical loads. That's why.
Yeah.
And other people who are close to a hospital or fire station are like, no, I ran, everything all day and never lost power.
But you did have a smart meter, we didn't use the smart meter infrastructure to more manage the outages very well. I mean, is there an opportunity there, do you think?
The thing that there were a couple of things that surprised me during the storm, but the first was, we have all these smart meters on the homes, which is good. All the IDR meters on the industrials, which is a huge portion of our load in this state, ERCOT's not pinging those. They're settling them and seeing them in real time. That's crazy, isn't it? It's crazy. So, so one of the things we're working with our customers on is getting the AMS metering in so that we can and they can see in real time. I mean, you're talking a big portion of the load in the state, and ERCOT was blind to whether they were online or offline. And I do think if they could have seen how much of that industrial load was already offline, the Thursday, Friday answer is probably less severe than what we had happen. Because ERCOT couldn't tell who was on or who was off or who was at minimum or who was, broken at that point.
Yeah, I don't know, and I wasn't on the commission then, but I don't know why a third of the load in Texas, the most important loads, are still on don't have connectivity. That just doesn't make any sense to me. And that's a market design that needs to be changed. I do, we got a lot of questions here, and I'm enjoying this, but I'm going to have to cede the floor in a second and let some of the folks who are on the webinar ask questions. But I do want to ask you, because you mentioned the last 32 hours, and that has been a bone of contention. And I know, you have a perspective on it. But tell me about what you think. You think that maybe it was the right answer to keep the prices at 9,000, and if so, a lot of there's been a lot of pain that's been resulting from that. So, kind of what's your perspective on that?
Well, I showed that one chart from 6 a.m. Thursday morning that showed ERCOT load going back up over 60,000 and not enough generation to meet it. And the stories by Thursday morning were coming in that people had died. I think what is the right price? If you're like, okay, it was such a bad event, people died. We were trying to get stability back to the power grid. Again, it's not my role to make that call, but I believe that the people in the control rooms at ERCOT and at the Public Utility Commission were having discussions and said, we need to make sure the lights stay on. And we need to make sure that we don't end up back where we were. And we've got so much stuff broken, we don't know, So it is a terrible question. I think that the unintended consequence of it, where the real time, the ORDC adders being so large, like there wasn't, when we ran some of our tail risk scenarios, it's not a scenario we ever contemplated for that duration. But I can understand why the folks made the decision that they did. I mean, at that point, you are trying to keep the backbone of the power grid alive, and you just spent how many days without sleeping trying to keep it, and your first sign of stability, I don't know if you just relinquish the reins to the market itself, but it is, in hindsight, we need to sharpen our pencils on the playbook of what it looks like.
I'm going to ask you two other questions, and I promise I'll turn it over and ask the ones in the chat. So my first question is, what was Chris Tomlinson's column in the Chronicle today and Russell Gold's column in the Wall Street Journal? And because you know a lot about this from your days and working on, in fact, I think you ran the demand response task force, I believe, way back when. So there's been a lot of criticism of ERCOT around this program called ERS, which probably no one but you and I and a few other energy nerds really know about. I don't mean that you're an energy nerd, but
I wear that badge proudly.
But I think do you want to comment on that? Do you have a perspective on this idea that ERCOT was turning off, critical gas supplies? That's the allegation that's been made, and I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I thought I'd give you a chance to address it.
Yeah, I would say, and I was chair of the demand side working group at ERCOT for 6 years, and so I have been a very loud voice. And again, in my role as Switzerland, making the rules transparent and equal for everyone, so that no one group or market participant type has a leg up on anybody else. So in our history as a power grid, because Texas is an island and we're not synchronized with the rest of the country, and we have 2 very large nuclear power stations that can trip and have been struck by lightning and other strange things that happen, unavoidable, like what happened in February with South Texas Project. We have had to put tools in place to help make sure that we had a robust grid, even if one of those 2 monster power stations trips unexpectedly. So we've had demand response as part of our DNA, since early days post deregulation. I think as far as whether it's emergency response service or responsive reserve service or non-spin or controllable loads, they do have an important part to play because of the topography of the Texas grid and the fact that we are an island. I'm going to leave it at that. Okay.
Well, let me ask you this question, and I'm looking at the chat, and there's a few that we might want to think about a little. What do we need to do we have new leadership at the PUC, we have new leadership at ERCOT, and some of these folks you and I know from many years ago. Brad Jones has been a colleague and friend. What needs to happen, do you think, to restore confidence in these institutions and in the market itself?
Well, I think one is to stop the pointing fingers and get to the root cause analysis and actually fix problems versus throw people under the bus, which I think is an easy thing to say. It's maybe a little bit harder in practice. We certainly do have a bit of a PR problem, in the state of Texas around our energy grid right now. And, I was at an event and someone from California said, here, hold my beer. What was Texas thinking? I gave a speech 6 months ago or so to University of Houston, and they were asking about different power markets. And I said, no, ERCOT's my favorite. It's like, unlike your children, you are allowed to have a favorite market. And, I really do believe in the transparency and deregulation. And, our market has functioned very well. It's been very cost effective. We've got a lot of industrials who continue to come to the state of Texas. We've deployed more renewables. You start looking at all of our successes. This event, the weather was the villain. It was Category 5 hurricane hitting the entire state. And we need to do a better job of planning around these types of weather events, which are going to continue to happen. And words like unprecedented or 100-year, I think we should erase from our vocabulary. We want a resilient power grid that can withstand, the February event for 2 more days on top. And how do we make sure that we can provide, because as a society we cannot go days without electricity. Everything we do depends on it. So it's a kind of long-winded answer to that. But.
Okay, well, I'll just take the moderator's prerogative and let you say, and it's on our website at the Center for Houston's Future in case you're interested. But after the 2011 blackout, I wrote an op-ed in the Dallas Morning News that basically looked at the situation in the legislature and all the finger pointing that went on there, and compared it to Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express, where basically at the end of the day, everybody was responsible for the murder. And I think that's absolutely the case here. And, no one took responsibility back then, and everybody needs to take responsibility now. And until we do that, we're not going to solve these problems. And so I do think, as a former policymaker, that it's really incumbent to restore the confidence in the grid that we do address some of these problems. And if we don't do it now, and we have another one of these events, I think that shame on us for not addressing it. So now is the time to get this done and restore confidence in the market. Anyway, that's sort of my take on it. There is a couple questions here, so let me just shift in the few minutes we have left to asking questions. And I some of these won't surprise you. We're going to get the energy only versus capacity market sort of debate going again. So Cliff Braddock wants to know how to respond to those who advocate to abandon the energy only market in favor of capacity market, and how to respond to those who advocate that ERCOT should join neighboring ISOs. So 2 questions for you that have been, I guess, on many people's minds.
Well, we've seen brownouts in capacity markets. I mean, a capacity market does not prevent a brownout from happening. Robust planning and infrastructure does. So, I think it's a bit of apples and oranges, and maybe I know some power stations and IPPs who would like to see ERCOT become a capacity market. Again, I'm Switzerland. I don't own any power stations in Texas, so I do think that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That we've had a very vibrant Texas power grid. We had a horrific event in February. We did a terrible job planning for it. We did a terrible job communicating to the public what was about to happen. And even through the event, I don't think we had a strong voice out helping make sure that we were making smart decisions and keeping people informed with how long could this go on. So to the capacity thing, we've seen issues in capacity markets. I don't think it's the saving grace. we do have mechanisms to incentivize building assets here. We clearly continue to have interest in building power stations in the great state of Texas. As far as synchronizing with the rest of the grid, again, I don't think that wouldn't have changed what happened in February. Our neighboring grids wouldn't have had any power to spare us. They would have shut us off if we had tried to suck too much out of their regions. You know, when you look at the size of the Texas power grid, it's about the same size as the UK power grid, which is also not synchronized with mainland Europe. Functions very well. You know, pretty resilient power grid. So I don't think synchronization has to happen. Maybe a few more DC ties or switchable power stations to go between the two, but again, I don't think it would have changed what happened in February.
Well, it may not change to what happened in February, and we're running out of time, so I'll just ask you this as kind of the last question, and we can leave it at this. You know, we're talking about with climate change, putting a lot more responsibility on the grid. The real strategy for addressing climate change is a clean energy standard, which talks about electrifying everything. So we want to move, you know, a lot of cars from internal combustion engines to electric. We want to put a lot more responsibility, you know, on the grid, on renewable, and have more renewables. You know, is that so? How do we think about that? How do we think about the interface between this idea of moving towards a decarbonization, sort of, you know, something we have to do, and reliability and interconnection? And if you can answer all that in 3 minutes.
Well, I was going to maybe you know, anecdotally say, last night I was talking to my youngest brother who lives on the East Coast, and he was concerned about the Colonial Pipeline shutdown and the gas shortages up there, and hours waiting in line to get gasoline, to which I sent him a picture of my Tesla. And his response to me was, how'd that work out for you in February? And so it definitely, you know, you have to be careful what you wish for. You might get it. So the electrification of everything, clearly from a climate change and reducing carbon emissions, is the direction we all want to head. I think that highlights how we need resiliency to make sure that when these types of events happen, if all of our cars are electric, we can't have 4 days of no, you know, electricity, or 5 days. We need reliable, clean energy. Yeah.
And do you think we're doing a good job on thinking about that, or do you think that? And this is kind of a maybe a you know, a difficult question to ask, but do you think the energy industry is doing a good job of thinking about how we go about creating a reliable grid, you know, in this sort of decarbonized world of the future, or is there more work to do there?
I think there's a lot more work to be done. I think we've got very interested up and coming. This next generation is really passionate about clean energy and wants to work on clean energy. One of my boys is in engineering school right now, and he's super excited about hydrogen and kind of what the potential for that could be. So I think we've got a good base to work from. I think we all need to say that the answer for the next couple decades is going to be an integrated grid with gas, with probably still some coal, with lots of wind and batteries and solar, and it isn't going to be one technology that gets us, you know, between here and a 100% carbon-free future with the electrification of everything. So we got some work to do.
Good. Well,
but we've made tremendous progress on, you know, cleaning up our power grids and being efficient. Like, you think Senate Bill 7, the whole thing was to be more efficient around power station dispatch and make sure that we're not running inefficient units when we've got more efficient ones sitting idle. And so we've come a long way, but there's still quite a bit of work to do.
Yeah. And, you know, I just, the Texan in me says, I think Texas will get there first. So I think we will make decarbonization work in Texas, perhaps faster and cheaper and better than anywhere else. And Mary Anne, I look forward to working with you on that challenge. for working for a French company, you certainly are Switzerland. And it's been great to have this chance to talk to you about some of these answers. And Constance, thanks for inviting me to be part of the discussion today. And for those who tuned in, thanks for listening. And I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Certainly an entertaining one. And hopefully we'll see you next time.